even after all of the compromises that were reached during the Constitutional Convention, and we talked about two of them by taking a look at the Great Compromise as the Three-Fifths Compromise. The textbook points out another one was the idea about the creation of the Electoral College. There was concern that we would create an American king if we had an executive, which the framers felt we needed to have, that we would end up creating an American king. And so they thought that an electoral college would be a way to make sure we wouldn't have such an American king. I will leave it to you to take a look at the textbook to do that and to figure out whether or not the Electoral College did its job in the 2016 election. Okay, that's not entirely fair, but some people have argued that if the Electoral College is meant to work, and to stop against that, there are some who felt that the Electoral College didn't work as it should have with the election of Donald Trump. Kind of political statements aren't really tested here. It's more just to think about that for those who believe that and think that, to kind of fit that in the of what the framers wanted when they created this. But the main thing we want to talk about is the idea of the ratification process, because even though the Constitutional Convention ended with a creation of a document that changed pretty significantly the Ars Confederation, it needed to be ratified. And one interesting thing is, according to the Articles of Confederation, the Supreme Time, it required unanimous support in order to change the Articles of Confederation. But they just decided, the National Congress decided that it would only require 9 of 13 states. And that was going to be pretty important and pretty hard to do, but it's already some important thing that the fundamental rule of law, the Arts Confederation, that said you needed to have unanimity in order to change the Arts Confederation in any way. And certainly if you're going to replace it, you need unanimity. They just ignored that and said, no, it's going to be ratified with 9 of 13 states. And some states needed to be persuaded to do this. The ratification process was going to be done by each state under the Confederation. The state governments were the unit that had the most authority, and so each state had to decide whether or not they wanted to ratify the U.S. Constitution. And one thing we will see when we talk about the elements of the U.S. Constitution, one thing we see for sure is that moving from the Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution clearly took power away from the states and gave it to the national government. And so states needed to be persuaded that, in fact, this was a good deal. They knew what they were, complete monopoly on power, and moving to a system where the national government would have some power. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about in the next set of lectures about U.S. Constitution and the system of government it creates. But we will also talk about that when we talk about the idea of federalism, because what was created under the U.S. Constitution is a federal system as opposed to a confederal system. And the federal system is one in which there are two systems of government that have sovereignty. Both the state governments and the national governments have authority. But the states needed to be persuaded to make that trade, get rid of the Articles of Confederation, and instead replace it with the U.S. Constitution. And so what that needed was further persuasion. The persuasion was done through what is known as the Federalist Papers. There were 85 pamphlets that were written by James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. James Madison was from Virginia, and we talked about him as being the father of the U.S. Constitution. And John Jay and Alexander Hamilton were from New York. It's a recognition that even though any one of 13 states would be necessary to turn the Articles of Confederation into the U.S. Constitution, there were certain states who were critically important, and those two states were New York and Virginia. Both of them needed to ratify that, even though mathematically you could have come up with another set of 9 states without having those two. And so you had that James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton contributed to the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers serve a number of purposes. One is it was clearly political propaganda. It was meant to persuade, it was meant to convince people that the U.S. Constitution was better than the Articles of Confederation. And so when you read the Federalist Papers, there is certainly that. But at the same time, it is a discussion of why the framers were doing what they were doing. It is an expression of political philosophy, and it is an American political philosophy. And so if you take upper division level courses in political philosophy, political theory, here at Cal State Long Beach or elsewhere, there are courses devoted to it to talk about what sort of system of government is created when you come up with this federal system that we have, this system of a republic that's not fully a democracy, but at the same time want to make sure that it controls the authority of the government. So we need to see them as both. But the Federalist Papers were critically important. I have you read three of them, number 10, number 51, and number 78. Those are ones that are particularly important in terms of an expression of larger philosophical ideas. But the Federalist Papers were put out there as a way to indicate the ways in which certain states needed to be convinced to ratify the Constitution. But during the debate, one of the major compromise needed to be reached, and that was many of the states were concerned that the U.S. Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights or the U.S. Constitution. There were amendments because they were not originally part of the document that was sent to the states for the ratification. That's why they're called amendments. It amended the original document. That we talked about because they're an important expression of political liberty in our system of government. It is also one of the things that most people, both in the United States and around the world, point to as a key important part of our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the things that people support the most of the Bill of Rights. We may disagree whether we have an electoral college or not, whether we can't elect judges, things like that. Equal representation in the Senate, things can be debated, but virtually everyone, of course, people can complain and maybe say there aren't enough things in there, but virtually everyone supports the Bill of Rights, and so it's somewhat part of it originally. What we want to do is to think about this, is to discuss why it wasn't included in the first place. And Alexander Hamilton lays out in the Federalist Papers the argument as to why a Bill of Rights was both unnecessary and dangerous. And I like that in terms of, again, in terms of political philosophy, it's interesting, we're going to talk about that, but also in terms of propaganda, it grabs your attention. The Bill of Rights that everyone thinks is the most important, he argues is unnecessary. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. We like it, but you say it's unnecessary? And then he goes further. He's like, no, it's actually dangerous to have a Bill of Rights. And you're like, whoa, now you got my attention. And so what we want to do is to kind of go through that argument. So the reason why Alexander Hamilton said that a Bill of Rights was unnecessary is that the national government, as created under the U.S. Constitution, with all of these separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, the fact that it's difficult to amend the Constitution, the Electoral College, all of those things put into place to make it so you don't need a Bill of Rights. You don't need to protect individual liberties because the national government won't have the authority to infringe on those liberties. It doesn't have the authority. It can't do it. No one branch or all branches working together will be able to violate those. They include a Bill of Rights. And then, if that's not persuasive, he turns around and says, it's actually dangerous to have a Bill of Rights. And I'm like, really? Why would it be dangerous to argue that there's freedom of speech, or there won't be illegal search and seizure, or you're protected against cruel and unusual punishment? And the reason why Alexander Hamilton says that it is dangerous to have is because if you attempt to list all of the different freedoms that individuals have, you're inevitably going to miss something. And if you miss something, because you came up with a list, it implies that you've thought about this. And you said, no, these are the ones that are protected. They're in the Bill of Rights. Anything not be infringed, those freedoms can be taken away. And so some argue that one important liberty that was missed was the idea of the right to privacy, that was not included in the Bill of Rights. And those who believe very strongly in privacy rights suggest that the United States government is able to infringe on privacy precisely because it's not in the Bill of Rights. To this idea that Alexander Hamilton was perhaps right, that his philosophical statement is one that makes sense. It was also to justify why they didn't include a Bill of Rights in the first one, so there was also politics involved. But it's important also to see that the framers lost the battle because we have the Bill of Rights. And what the states demanded is they said, look, we will contingently ratify this Constitution. We ratify this Constitution with the promise that the national government, as its first act, will add a Bill of Rights. And many states adopted that and said, we will withdraw our support for this if there aren't a Bill of Rights. And so many people include part of the U.S. Constitution. Officially it is, of course, once amended, but as part of the plan put forward by the framers, even though the framers themselves in the first instance during the Constitutional Convention did not have the Bill of Rights. And so the Bill of Rights was added after the U.S. Constitution was ratified. And so, just as a reminder, the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, were added as part of the deal. So that explains the history. There's a lot more that we could talk about, but I think we've gone through that quite a bit. So now we're going to move on and talk about the structures of government that are created by the U.S. Constitution.